Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Pearls of Wisdom podcast. Today, we are privileged to be joined by Dr. Mikhail, also known as Deacon Severus. Dr. Mikhail received his doctorate in history from UCLA and now teaches history at California State University, Fullerton. Dr. Mikhail is also an ordained deacon in the Coptic Orthodox Church. He is here with us today to discuss his book, From Byzantine to Islamic Egypt: Religion, Identity, and Politics After the Arab Conquest. Dr. Mikhail, thank you for joining us today.
No, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, my pleasure. So why don't you begin by telling us about yourself and your background?
Well, in a nutshell, after we immigrated to the U.S., we immigrated, I was about 9 or so. Spent most of my life and education in Southern California. Most of what I studied started off with kind of a focus on monasticism, and kind of one thing eventually led to another. And then more or less kind of a lot of my studies and publications focus on Egypt, Middle East more widely, but especially Egypt, kind of from that late antique into early Islamic period. But for the Coptic material in particular, I tend to venture beyond that chronological boundary per se.
And may I ask, what is it that drew you to your particular discipline, history and I guess Coptic studies, if that's what you want to call it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it started off with, as I mentioned, with my interest in monasticism. And as you start looking to monasticism, first it was kind of the 4th, 5th century material. The more you start digging into that, the more you realize that, a lot of these texts were written actually a bit later, and they're preserved in later recensions and in Arabic and Syriac and what have you. So kind of one thing led to the other. And at UCLA, I was there at a point where we had Professor Claudia Rapp there dealing with the late antique material, and Michael Moroni dealing with the kind of early Middle East and Caliphate. And that just kind of seemed like a natural fit, focus on those two. And at that point in time, we also had Professor Antonio Lopreno in the Near Eastern studies. So, doing the Coptic with him and various dialects and what have you, that was natural. Didn't really have to go beyond the institution. And with Jim Gelvin doing the modern Middle East, that kind of provided me with kind of not only a chronological continuation to what I studied, but also I think an interesting and important point of reference, especially methodologically, onto the earlier material. But it kind of happened somewhat organically, if you will.
And we mentioned the fact that you are a member of the Coptic Church and a deacon in that church. So I'd be curious to know if your faith has influenced your work, or perhaps even vice versa. Again, if you don't mind my asking.
No, that's perfectly fine. I mean, it does on multiple levels. But in general, I think whether I'm dealing with Coptic history, whether I'm dealing with Islamic history, whether I'm dealing with, Jews in the Middle Ages, whatever the topic is, or biblical studies for that matter, I do dabble a little there. For me, it's really important to kind of focus on the evidence, the text, and the interpretation. A lot of things, especially if you approach it from a purely church angle. Unfortunately, we kind of have within the Coptic Church, we tend to have something of a reactionary pose, where you kind of, if it's something you haven't heard before or challenges anything, at all. You defend, maybe think about it down the line, but defend first, defend later. That's never really been my approach. You know, I perhaps in my my more idealistic bent, it was always about, you know, what's the evidence? How do we know what we know? And you know, that at some point you do come to a bit of a boundary, if you will, between what we know and what we cannot know, and that, you know, that gray area, that's where faith steps in. But you know, faith doesn't really inform kind of the hardcore scholarship aspect of it, because scholarship in general will take you up to that gray area, but it's not really equipped to deal with the gray area.
Interesting. And may I also ask, how do members of your community or our community react to your scholarship?
Well, those that know that I exist, you mean? It's usually appreciative.
Okay.
There are some that I think find it a little, oh, what's the word for it? Slightly unsettling.
I see.
Because as I mentioned, I mean, I'm not really interested in just simply regurgitating Sunday school stories. I really want to dig in and see, well, what is, you know, whether it's the linguistic shift or, you know, with my studies of Pope Demetrius, you know, it's what is, you know, what is the factual basis there? How has it been interpreted? And what are kind of the logical, solid conclusions that we can draw from the information? Most find that approach sufficient. Some would like me to perhaps, it's been suggested to me on several occasions to leave certain things out, but
okay.
I'm, you know, for me, history, if it's going to have any didactic purpose at all, you have to deal with it as good, bad, and ugly. And if you fail to learn from the bad and the ugly, you're not really going to learn from the good either.
Right.
It's one and the same.
Yes, and I just think that it might be disorienting or unsettling, as you say, for religious believers and non-believers alike to say to examine their views they take for granted from a different angle. Anyway, on to your book.
No, and in general, I mean, I tend to be, well, my approach in general does tend to be more conservative than not.
Yeah.
Because I you know, I'm a little bit weary of theory in general. And I tend not to be impressed by shiny objects, if that makes any sense. Something really has to prove itself on the factual basis and an intellectual level to be kind of worthy of consideration, not just simply that it's it goes against perceived wisdom or anything like that. If it's you know, if I write about something, research against about something, and the conclusion goes against perceived wisdom, personally, you know, I've looked into this deeply. I don't publish such things lightly.
Okay. I respect that. So now onto your book. So can you tell us how, from Byzantine to Islamic Egypt, how did that book first come about?
You know, like every grad student who's kind of done with their MA and their graduate exams and kind of they're in search for that thesis, it kind of grew over time. I mean, to some extent, I have to think that at least on a subconscious level, Professor Michael Moroni's own work definitely informed that. His work at kind of same transitional period in Iraq. But in Egypt, for me, this was a period that's not not that well studied. And it's kind of in the opening chapter of the book, I kind of mentioned the disciplinary boundaries and chronological boundaries that kind of typically keep scholars researching pre-conquest or post-conquest, but you never really look at not only the conquest, but kind of conquest with broad borders, Chalcedon to roughly the Fatimids.
Okay, and so your book is on the Arab conquest of Egypt. So, but before
No, it's on that. It's well, just a minor correction. One chapter is on the conquest. The rest of it is really on the ramifications and the aftermath.
I was going to say, but before discussing those institutional and ideological ramifications wrought by the Arab conquest, can you tell us about maybe the religious landscape and the socio-political realities in Egypt prior to the conquest, so while it was still under Byzantine rule?
Well, I mean, it's those 200 years, and it's 190 years, but it's roughly 2 centuries from Chalcedon to the Arabs. You know, you have 2 major junctions, pre-Justinian, post-Justinian. In many ways, the confessional allegiances and hierarchies are a lot clearer after Justinian than before Justinian. On the other hand, post-Justinian is also when we get a lot of fragmentation. There's a lot of offshoots of various Christian groups in Egypt. And this is where kind of, you know, there's a lot of literature over the last 30 years about this period. And one of the major questions is, you know, are we looking at, what are the numbers that we're looking at? You know, and that's very difficult to quantify. Because on one hand, I mean, I remember in the book, I enumerated, I think, 9 or 10 Christian factions in Egypt on the eve of the conquest. Where does kind of that branch that becomes the Coptic Church, was it just simply 1 out of 9? Did it constitute 1/9 of the Christian population in Egypt? Or, as I think the evidence favors, yeah, we have all of these groups, but most of them, you know, they appear to be quite marginal. We don't really have anything to lead us to believe that they had contingency or populations outside of Alexandria. In most cases, the few that do, they're kind of restricted to the Delta. And throughout the whole period, Upper Egypt seems to be kind of in a world of its own. None of these factions are mentioned, not even the Chalcedonian Schism really comes up in the context of the material we have from Upper Egypt.
Okay, and so you've mentioned the Chalcedonian Schism or the Council of Chalcedon a number of times, but just for those of our listeners who may not be familiar with that, could you just explain that briefly, or in as much depth as you would like to?
A harder question perhaps has never been posed. Chalcedon is messy. The Council of Chalcedon is very messy on a very basic level. This is where we have the schism between largely Antioch and Alexandria on one side, Constantinople, Rome, and Jerusalem on the other, disagreeing about the nature of Christ. Now, this gets very technical very quickly, but I think that the important thing to realize is that Chalcedon, above all, is just, in my reading of it, is more tragic than anything. It's a tragedy. You have a major schism within the Christian East, keeping in mind kind of back then that, you know, Islam is still not in the picture. The East is solidly Christian, and if anything, the East is more populous than the West. So you have this major schism in the East, and there really is no real theological divide here. It's a lot of potato about how do you discuss the two natures in one, and each faction unintentionally, perhaps in some cases intentionally, misinterpreting the other's vocabulary, and picking vocabulary out of one theological system and kind of forcing it into another where it doesn't work. And when it doesn't work, it just get labeled heresy. And it's, well, yeah, it's not going to work in your theological system because it really has to be understood within this context, understood within their respective context. The Chalcedonian formula, with all of our reservations about it, every bit as orthodox as what we say. The problem even there is that it's not so much that the Chalcedonian formula is quote unquote Nestorian, it's that it's susceptible to an Nestorian interpretation.
Right.
I'm afraid that's as best as I'll be able to do kind of Chalcedon in a nutshell, because it does get to be quite messy. But again, from my reading, as long as you understood the terminology used by the respective camps within their theological understanding and within their theological framework, they're both essentially saying that you have one person, one individual, Jesus Christ, who was 100% divine, 100% human, who saves humanity. And he is able to do this because he is the incarnate Logos. Everything else has to deal with kind of this theological misrepresentation in some cases. And we're also kind of forgetting that there's a lot of politics that lead into Chalcedon. For the preceding century, there's a very clear pattern of Alexandria and Antioch not being happy with Constantinople. That scenario replays over and over and over again throughout the second half of the 4th century into the first half of the 5th century. That's not by accident. There are political and ecclesiastical politics in play here. On a scale that we don't really have a current point of reference to discuss.
And so would you say that that there were essentially political disputes that simply masqueraded as religious disputes, at least to some extent?
To some extent, the early on, it's largely religious. But it has to do with prestige and pride. Once Constantinople gets named the new Rome, Rome is angry because now Rome gets to be called old, and nobody likes to be called old. But as far as Rome is concerned, there is no new Rome. There's only Rome, and that's them. And it gets the label of New Rome, but it also becomes the first seat in the East, over and above the older, more founded powerhouses of Alexandria and Antioch, who up until this point have been producing just one theologian after another. Here comes Constantinople, that literally didn't exist aside from being just a very small diocese prior to Constantine. And now this kind of up and comer gets the first position, the primary position in the East. As far as Alexandria or Antioch are concerned, they should be first. And if not first, then second. And they find themselves behind Constantinople. With that labeling and that position, theological and political, that Constantinople steps into as the new Rome. Rome doesn't like it, Alexandria doesn't like it, Antioch doesn't like it. And when you look at the history of ordinations, for a while there, it's also a competition between Antioch and Alexandria as to who's going to get their candidate to be appointed over the see of Constantinople. Because if they're going to have to play the politics and they're going to be second to anybody, it's going to be their man, if you will.
I see.
So it gets complicated and it gets messy, and it's not really edifying reading. This is
Yes. And so the Chalcedonian Schism was of course not the was I guess not the first major schism in Christendom, because the Church of the East had already parted ways with the rest of Christendom before
Yes and no. Yes and no, because kind of the official split, that doesn't happen till after Chalcedon.
Okay.
So there also you have another complicated story, but one in which, again, there's a lot of terminology that has to be understood within very specific contexts. We often kind of forget that the Church of the East fully accepts the same creed that we accept, the same creed that the Greek Orthodox accept, the same creed that the Church of Rome accept. It's the Nicene Constantinople. So kind of a lot of the really flagrant accusations of, dividing the one Son of God into two sons and so on and so forth. Again, when you look at what they're trying to say and how they discuss Christ, I would say that there are issues with the terminology used. The idea is the same. They want to safeguard the notion that it's that you have full human there, that is a full humanity of Christ, not a pseudo humanity.
Okay, and I just wanted to ask if the Chalcedonian Schism had any impact on the Church of the East. And I was also wondering, so the suggestion is sometimes made that one of the reasons for animosity between the Church of the East and the rest of Christendom is that the Church of the East was part of the Persian Empire. So would you think that led to any tension between the Church of the East on the one hand and I guess Christianity in the or the what we might call the Imperial Roman Church?
They were kind of in a very untenable, uneasy situation. To maintain full contact with Constantinople and Rome in the 5th century was very problematic for them, because when you take into account the politics between the two empires during that period, that definitely had something to do with it. There is an aspect to the divide that is clearly political, but nonetheless, the divide officially kind of comes down the line of, again, theological disputes and the like. It just, some of the really flagrant sort of things, accusations against the Church of the East, we have to be careful when we kind of regurgitate them blindly. These were kind of accusations made by kind of the side that we like against the side that we don't, that really kind of takes a lot of what they're saying out of context.
And in the first chapter of your book, you criticize the scholarship of the past century on the grounds that it tends to propound, and I quote, a pervasive nationalist reading that maintains the existence of an authentic, distinct, and unalterable Egyptian political and cultural consciousness that has defied foreign intrusions. And you call this the nationalist paradigm. So could you elaborate on this conventional scholarly view, and why do you find it problematic? Sorry, go ahead.
Well, it's scholarly, but it's also communal. Part of, on one hand, within scholarly circles, criticism of the nationalist reading of sources and finding quote unquote nations in the Middle Ages or ancient history has been criticized soundly for at least since the 1950s. The problem is that a lot of that literature either criticizes that reading and then just kind of leaves it open-ended, because if not that reading, then how do we read and interpret the material? Or what much of it does is that it'll criticize it, it'll disprove it on several occasions, and then as it goes on to kind of provide a new paradigm, the new paradigm is nothing more than the old paradigm with a new name. Okay. You still have this notion of a unique identity that is resistance, that is traceable in history, so on and so forth. On the communal aspect, You look at the early 20th century and kind of the forging of Egypt as kind of a modern nation state. There's this kind of trajectory now, not only to the Byzantine period, but all the way back to the pharaohs, that we have, Egypt as a country, distinct borders, distinct history, distinct people, going all the way back to the pharaohs. And granted, Egypt is a lot more difficult to undermine that reading than other places. For more often than not, the borders of Egypt being kind of natural geographic borders, they're very similar to what you find in other places. But when you actually look through the sources, the nationalist reading would kind of demand that during the Byzantine era, Egypt kind of was a country under control of an empire. That reading works out great in the 19th century and early 20th century, where you have the British there, and you have kind of a something of a parallel. It doesn't quite work when you look at the sources. And that was kind of my main contention, that this going in and reading this material with this blueprint in mind does us a disservice when we don't think about it in terms of this blueprint and just kind of see what is actually being said, what is being stated, how a society is structured. All indications are that Egypt and Egyptians viewed themselves as simply part of the empire. The pre-modern world, within the Middle East, the Mediterranean, so on and so forth, is a world of empires, not a world of nation states. And the problem is today, of course, we're just so fixed on thinking within the confines of the nation state. It's very difficult for us to think outside of it. But the evidence, as when I look at it, the fact that we've had 5 patriarchs who are Syrians, if you're going to think about it from a nationalist perspective, that makes no sense whatsoever. Either they didn't know what they were doing in the Middle Ages, or they conceive of the community, the church, in a very different blueprint, a different paradigm other than the nation state.
Right. And I'd just like to ask another question about the theology of the Coptic Church. So you state in your book that Egypt's anti-Chalcedonian, the beliefs of Egypt's Coptic community are habitually misunderstood or even distorted in the scholarly literature. So can you just could you explain how they are misconstrued in scholarship?
A lot of it, well, I should say that this is improving tremendously over the last few decades. But there are so many studies in which it'll go that, well, you had the Council of Chalcedon. Council of Chalcedon, Egypt is designated as monophysites. Monophysite means that you believe in one nature, and it's the one divine nature that absorbs or in which the humanity is diluted, and hence you only have one divine. And then they would quote, some of the passages quoted, testify directly against that. And yet it's almost like, scholars having this blueprint in their minds that the text should say X, even when it says Y, they're arguing that it says X. This is across the board. I mean, one of the classical studies in kind of Orthodox theology is Lossky's, Vladimir Lossky's Orthodox theology. That's it's in the 70s or so. That presents us again as kind of the counter narrative to the Nestorians. Behold, the Nestorians, they separate the one Christ into two, behold the monophysites, or the other end of the spectrum. They merge the two into one. It's a nice, tidy sort of paradigm. The problem with it is that it's completely inaccurate.
Okay. Right.
It does not truly reflect what is the theological literature has to say, or the liturgical literature has to say, because that also has a bearing when you have liturgical statements that directly testify against that. That has meaning, that has to be taken into account.
Okay. And now now my next question will be on the Arab conquest proper. So how did the Coptic community react to the Arab conquest? Because sometimes it is suggested that the Copts actually preferred Arab rule to Byzantine rule, and then they actually welcomed it. Now, you can speak to the truthfulness of that suggestion. So, but just in what light was the Arab conquest viewed by Coptic Christians?
Well, I mean, the narrative you set is still very popular, but it goes back to this nationalist reading that you had Egypt, the Copts, the Byzantine Empire coming and conquering them and forcing them to be under their quote unquote yoke.
Yes.
And here comes the Arabs who are promising liberation. And it's only later on that they kind of, increase taxes and start trying to convert people, so on and so forth. When you look at the sources and in general, the conquest, the Islamic conquest are kind of if not a it's not a full-fledged specialty now. It's kind of a subspecialty, but it's how to read that material is very, very difficult, simply because everything, and in the case of Egypt, everything relating to the conquest is written a good 200 years after the fact, if not more. So as you read this material now, you're kind of having to sift through alignments, realignments, rephrasing, all within an oral traditions, until 200 years later, when these traditions are written down, codified, and we have access to them today. From my research, when you look at everything, there's a multiplicity of responses. Some, and from both sides, because again, the nationalist thesis would have Copts welcoming the Greek Orthodox, the Melkites resisting to the bitter end. When you look at the actual evidence, you have multiplicity of responses all around. It's not just within the Copts, but it's the Melkites as well. What is interesting is that in the earliest material, where you do have accounts of Copts helping Muslims, it does emphasize that they're doing so under duress.
Oh, okay.
That this is not voluntary, that they're kind of forced into corvée labor of some sort or another, or that they are under fear of torture or death, but that it's not, hey, the Arabs are coming, they will liberate us from the evil Byzantines.
Yes.
Because the evil Byzantines teach heresy, and they have that Greek language that we absolutely hate. But the nationalist thesis, it has all of these trappings that fit into very nice, tidy boxes. But again, the problem is the evidence. This us against them. I'm sure we'll get to the issue of language later, but the notion that Greek is the language of heresy, and we stop using Greek after Chalcedon. I mean, all of that is I mean, it's hard to use another word other than fiction. It's so far removed from the evidence that we have that it's a narrative, but it's definitely not a historical narrative.
Right. And okay, so now I'd like to ask you, Dr. Mikhail, why do you call it the Arab conquest as distinct from the Islamic conquest? Are those two labels more or less interchangeable? Do you prefer one over the other?
I mean, on occasion you see it referred to as the Islamic Conquest. It's, you know, at that very early stage, you know, Arab and Muslim become somewhat synonymous. You have a minority of Jewish Arab tribes. You clearly have Christian Arab tribes, but more or less, kind of pagan Arabs are out of the picture, at least kind of in an official capacity. And Arab and Muslim at that early stage are more synonymous than not. Over time, as Islam spreads farther and becomes more diversified, then kind of Islamic becomes more appropriate. In general, for the early period, I kind of view them as somewhat synonymous.
Okay, that's fair. And what can you tell us about the early Muslim community in Egypt? So I'd like to ask also, had Islam already taken definite shape as a religion, or was it still in the process of developing? And I just want to ask, I'd just like to also say that there's a University of Chicago historian by the name of Fred Donor, who argues that Islam did not emerge in the form we know it today. It did not emerge until the beginning of the 8th century. So in the 7th century, he argues that it was more what he calls an inchoate, ill-defined believers movement, okay, which included members of both Christians and Jews, who were all considered mu'minin, believers. And and as I said, like Orthodox, it still took time for Orthodoxy to be defined and for the doctrines and practices of Islam to be worked out. So if you can just comment on that.
Yeah, no, you know, I think Fred Donner's research here is on a very solid foundation. The issue is, you know, at what point do we see that shift?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and is it at all places at all at different times? You know, what is happening in Egypt? By the time we get into the 690s and 700, 710, you know, a lot of kind of the main tenets of the religion are there. The Quran more or less is solidified by 690. But you also have to keep in mind that when we speak something like, you know, the jurisprudence and the Islamic schools of law, so on and so forth, if nothing else, all of these are attributed to founders that are yet to be born at 700. So much of kind of what becomes the bulwark of Islamic theology, jurisprudence, so on and so forth, that's still to be worked out.
Right.
The main outlines, the oneness of God, so on and so forth, and kind of the text of the Quran is there. But even with the text of the Quran, you know, you have, you know, there are long-winded medieval disputes about how do you read certain passages and how do you read certain words, because in the earliest material, there's no dotting and there's no vowel markings. And with Arabic, that can clearly influence the reading and the meaning of certain passages.
All right. And so how were Christians treated under Islamic or Arab rule, and how did this treatment change over time?
Well, it's hard to give you kind of a statement that will sum it all up, because
Right.
it fluctuated widely from one governor to the next. In some cases, the same governor, early and late tenure, you know, his attitude towards Christians and Jews were very different. The long arc of the narrative is that progressively they're losing rights. They're finding it more and more difficult to secure certain types of employment. Once you get into the Mamluk period, you know, especially in late 13th, but especially the 14th and 15th century. That's a very challenging, difficult period for Christians in Egypt. And a lot of rights and prerogatives that were kind of taken for granted, up until the year 800, really have to be adjudicated in some cases, kind of going to lawsuits and what have you, and in some cases bribes. We in the modern era we look very disfavorably upon bribes. Throughout the Middle Ages, that was quite normal.
Okay.
To get things done, but a lot of the things that were taken for granted all the way up until the year 700 with regards to personal status and control over religious buildings and what have you, that becomes a lot more problematic in the 1300s and 1400s.
And just out of curiosity, I'd like to ask how Muslims regarded Christians and vice versa, because we discussed Fred Donner's views on this matter, but it's often said that the Christians at the inception of Islam, Christians regarded Muslims more as just another group of heretics, and not as I guess you might say, like a completely new, not the same way they might regard another foreign religion. So just heretics who deviated from orthodoxy. So was that also the case in Egypt at the time of the Arab Conquest?
It most likely it was. You have to understand that the Islamic narrative of origins, the birth of the Prophet, the Hijrah, his death, the issues about succession, so on and so forth. All of that is really known to those who accept this tradition, who up until roughly 634 are living in the peninsula. Nobody else outside knows of the story or this narrative. And as they're introduced to the Arabs, all of a sudden they're kind of in a new guise. They're no longer kind of the merchants that they knew of. All of a sudden they're invading armies. And they're invading armies talking about this new religion that recognizes Jesus, it recognizes Abraham, that there's angels and demons, and do charity, be good.
Fasting.
But Jesus is not God, he's a prophet. And it's like, well, if this is all you knew about this new religion, your framework is, especially in the Roman Empire, well, we have Christians, we have Jews, and we have a very small peppering of polytheists here and there, more in memory than in reality. Which category do we fit them in? They're not polytheists because they're constantly talking about the one God and the oneness of God. So the polytheists, they're not that. And some actually, medieval Christian authors, even though they're kind of criticizing Islam and Islamic message, they do credit Muhammad for at least moving the Arabs from the category of polytheists to muwahhidun, those that believe in the oneness of God at least. But that very initial understanding appears to have been widespread, that these are just kind of coming in within the Judeo-Christian tradition, which Islam espouses. But the full idea of Muhammad as a prophet and bringing about a whole new prophecy, so on and so forth, it takes decades, not centuries, to spread. But at what point precisely do we have that new understanding? In the literature, we can make an argument that, by 690, by 700, there is this realization. But you see how this kind of leaves a gulf between 700 and 630.
Yes, and I think that's in that context, it's easier to understand why Christians regarded Muslims as they did. So now going back to relations, Muslim Christians relations at the time of the Arab conquest. So were there ever periods of peaceful coexistence, and were conversions to Islam ever coerced by the state? And what were, sorry, I'll ask those questions now, and I'll ask follow-up questions later.
Well, I think it differed greatly from time to time and from region to region. I think overall it was more harmonious than not. We have to keep in mind that when something makes it into the historical record, it's typically because the norm has been transgressed somehow. So when we hear of a persecution or something of that nature, the very fact that it's being mentioned, that should let us know that, well, this wasn't the norm, that something other than the norm is taking place during that period.
Right.
In that study, in the book, I do mention kind of the 5 accounts we have of forcible conversion in Egypt up until the 11th century. Clearly marginal, and several of those who are converted are allowed to go back to Christianity. So I would not say that it definitely was not the norm to be forced to convert. There were incidents and junctures in which that did happen. But in general, the conversion to Islam in Egypt is by and large through soft pressure, not hard. It's not somebody at the edge of a sword and you have to convert or we're going to kill you. It's, well, you're free to remain as a Christian, but you're going to lose your job tomorrow.
Okay.
Or you're going to pay extra taxes. You're constantly paying the jizya. During periods in which you have the debasement regulations. We're going to kind of go out of our way to make life for you as a Christian more difficult in a variety of ways. And you have to live under these conditions for years, and in some cases decades, before those rules are relaxed. But that's that indirect pressure, but it's constant.
Yes.
That is what drives conversion, or one of the aspects that drives conversion in Egypt. It's not conversion at the edge of a sword.
Right, I see. That makes sense. And you also discuss polemical and apologetic encounters between Egypt's religious communities. So can you tell us more about how these communities sought converts by what we might call more rational means and through argumentation?
I mean, it's hard to, conversion is such a multi-tiered, there's so many things in play that it's hard to kind of pin it down to one thing or another, because for some individuals, kind of the more articulate, logical discussions.
Sorry, we're back. My bad. I lost an internet connection, but sorry. If you don't mind, starting over. I had asked about conversions. So
yeah. I was just saying that there's always kind of a push and a pull with these sorts of things. One aspect was kind of the financial issue with the jizya and not having to pay the jizya. There is not having to put up with the humiliation of those regulations. I mean,
okay, sorry. Okay, just pick up wherever.
So, they're saying that there, on one hand, you have the jizya and the dhul regulations. On the other, you didn't really have an adequate response within the community. In Egypt, the kind of the responses as to how to address Islamic critiques of Christianity, that is a genre that begins in the mid-10th century.
Okay.
In the kind of Sawirus ibn Muqaffa with 950 onward. But there's a lot of valuable time that was lost there. That's 200 years of Abbasid rule, not even the Umayyads. The Umayyads are something of a, the Umayyads weren't really all that interested in having converts. The Abbasids were, and for 200 years, there just wasn't an ample response in Egypt.
And sorry, you just mentioned the term Gizya. So could you please just explain what that was? And do you think there was Quranic precedent for it?
I mean, there's one verse, Quranic verse that mentions the jizya, and it was a tax collected from non-Muslim males from the age of 14 roughly to 60 or 64, depending on what you read. In theory, anyone who was not able-bodied was exempt. In theory, religious authorities were exempt. We do have evidence to the contrary. But the big issue within the jizya is it is mentioned only once in the Quran, and there it is possible to understand it as a one-time tribute, not an annual tribute. Now that's not what it ends up being. It ends up being a kind of a yearly annual tax that has to be paid. But just the Quranic verse by itself, either interpretation, can be viewed as legitimate.
Okay.
But it ends up being an annual tax that was collected in Egypt probably until 1856, 1858.
Wow, that's a long time. So, so now, and as you sort of anticipated, I would like to discuss language. So, how did Arabic become the mother tongue of Egyptian Christians, and how did they gradually lose the language of Coptic?
Well, Coptic and Greek. Remember that there are plenty of those who followed, kind of lived in Egypt, who are Egyptian as anybody else, but they were completely Hellenized. For them, Greek was the primary language. One of the things that's habitually overlooked is the fact that most of our patriarchs, until the Arab Conquest, did not speak Coptic, did not speak a word of Coptic. Saint Athanasius is the one that's always brought up, but Saint Athanasius is clearly the exception, not the rule. The fact that he was able to speak Coptic, that's perhaps mentioned in the sources because that wasn't expected of the Patriarch of Alexandria. And we know that Saint Cyril and Dioscorus, when they traveled outside of Alexandria, they had translators with them. So the language issue is something that, again, that national narrative really loves, the kind of idea that, well, we're Copts, we have the Coptic language. The real linguistic situation is a lot more diverse. It starts off, the spread of Arabic kind of starts off with the government Arabizing its rosters. With that, now anyone who wanted to maintain their employment, and really for anyone who wanted to have their son succeed them in employment, because a lot of these edicts, they sound great on paper, but they don't really translate into actual social or cultural change for decades. On paper, 705, everything has to go from Greek to Arabic. Well, that's great and nice and fine, except that your entire bureaucracy, maybe 1 out of 100 speaks Arabic. Greek was the bedrock of the bureaucracy, so that takes time. But as that develops now, you have Christians beginning to teach their children Arabic. At the same time, Arabic is slowly kind of becoming not only the language of the political elites, but slowly now, through the translation projects of the 8th century, it becomes the language of learning. In Syria, beginning from the mid-9th century on, It's also increasingly, actually early, you can make an argument for early 9th century. It's increasingly becoming the language of Christian theology. So all of this is happening somewhat simultaneously. And by the time we get to the 10th century, you know, if you're going to be a physician, if you're going to be employed by the government, if you know anything other than farming, you're going to need to learn Arabic and know it at a high level. Other factors have to do with the demilitarization of the Arabic population. You know, it was one thing under the Umayyads during the first half of their rule when Arab translated to Muslim, translated to living away on their own army barracks. Once they no longer did that, and now they're your next door neighbor or their neighbors in the other part of the village, and you're all farmers, and you are interacting with them more regularly, and your kids are interacting more regularly. The Arabic language increasingly becomes more and more important for everyday life. And Coptic increasingly kind of retreats to really just ecclesiastical usage and eventually becomes just a liturgical language, not much beyond that.
Okay. And now just to transition to our next topic, the agrarian revolts. So can you tell us about these revolts and how successful or unsuccessful were they, and what factors contributed to their success or lack thereof?
Well, the agrarian revolts have the very poorly designated title of being the Coptic revolts.
Okay. Yes.
So they keep on, you know, all of these authors keep on mentioning as kind of the last stand of the Christians against the Muslims, and the stance of the local population against the outside invaders. And there you can kind of see again Egypt British undertones. Here, this is one of those cases where, again, of knowing that this is so popular in the literature, this is one of those things I looked at quite carefully. None of the evidence points to anything religious. If we are used to use the term Coptic and Coptic revolt, it just simply as a very literal meaning of Egyptian. These are Egyptian revolts because they were carried out by Egyptian farmers. And as you look, especially towards the ones in the late 8th century and the early 9th century, it's clear that Muslims and Christians are rioting together. So the idea that this is Christian versus Muslim, or that this is the oppressed versus the oppressors, none of that really works. Everything I've seen really puts it within the tradition of agrarian revolts all across the globe. Wherever you have a land reform, there's typically riots after that. Land reforms are never popular with farmers, for better or for worse. I mean, they provide a great deal of opportunity for unscrupulous figures to exploit the farmers. It also allows the government to really tax farmers on what is being farmed, because if you're carrying this once every 2-3 generations, and on paper you're farming 10 acres, but your father, the register there was done under your grandfather's years, and your father was able to reclaim another 5, those 5, you're farming them, you're earning from them, but they're off the books. You're not really paying taxes on them until that new census comes along. And now they're going to say, hey, wait a minute, we thought you're farming 20 acres, you're really farming 25 acres. So now we're going to increase your taxes. It's one of these necessary evils, because you have to have land surveys, but at the same time, farmers notoriously do not like them. Taxes are often increased after tax census. And again, if you get an unscrupulous tax figure who's going to come and tell you, you know what, you are farming 20 acres, but unless you pay me X amount of money, I'm going to write it down as 25. You know, there is exploitation, there's so many venues of exploitation that we don't even think about in the modern era.
Right. So, can you tell us more about how Christians and Muslims were willing to set aside their religious differences to revolt alongside each other?
Well, I mean, this I think is a reflection of regionalism, and this is important because it does show us that there is kind of new communal bounds or bonds that are being forged among Christians and Muslims. It is important because, especially for the Muslim community, it's clear that it's no longer just Muslim versus non-Muslim, because Muslim farmers now are realizing that their fortunes are much more aligned with their Christian neighbors than it is with the Muslim government. That in some ways it kind of problematizes the issue of kind of religion superseding other facts of society or aspects of society. Every decision really has to be weighed against a multiplicity of factors, in which religion is one of the factors, and in some cases the primary factor, but not in every case, and not necessarily so.
Okay, so thank you for that. And my next question is going to be on the views of the Coptic Church on what we might call church-state relations or church empire relations. So in chapter 9 of your book, this is the subject of 9th chapter of your book, which you devote to, among other things, a discussion of what you call the various ideological conceptions of political authority among the Christian hierarchy and population. So first of all, how did Christians and Jews interpret Islamic dominion? What was it seen as a punishment from God or something else? Or just if you can speak to that.
Well, I mean, on and off. I mean, there was that aspect, but you also have to keep in mind that I had mentioned that you don't really have this antagonism against the Byzantines during Byzantine rule, but this is a narrative that starts coming in from the 9th century on. So if we're in the context of the 11th century, the 12th century, this is where kind of this narrative of kind of consistent oppression, if you will, finds some thread of legitimacy in that it perceives falsely, but it perceives Byzantine rule as oppressive, and now Islamic rule as oppressive. And in some regards, there is the notion of those being in power being there because of God's will. And hence, at no point do you find Christians advocating rebellion as kind of an ideological premise. They do not support rebellion. They view the rulers as God-given. But there's also a ton of interpersonal dynamics in play. One of the worst periods was with Al-Hakim bin Billah, who's by any measure kind of an exception within the long view of Fatimid rule. But even there were mechanisms by which Christians were able to get a little bit of relief here and there, and in some cases inexplicably so. It's not always clear. In other cases, we had secretaries, important secular figures who kind of became the voice of the community and the church to those in power and authority, and that pattern repeats throughout our history. As recently as kind of the modern era with the coming of Napoleon and Ibrahim al-Bukhari and his brother, those had the ear of the government in a manner that no clergy at the church at the time could match. They were the leaders of the Coptic community. And today, of course, this is difficult for us to imagine because we're in such a clerical mode of being at the moment, where you can't even imagine, well, who would speak on behalf of the community other than the patriarch, other than the bishops.
Right.
But in much of our history, you find that these individuals, although they held important offices, they were not really the ones who spoke on behalf of the community to the government. These were secular elites who took on that responsibility. Not always. Again, we have a long history, so that fluctuates over time. But there's definitely no shortage of secular elites who were at the helm of the community, who in some cases handpicked bishops, handpicked patriarchs. The ecclesiastical establishment was really at their discretion, more the other way around.
Okay. All right. Thank you for your helpful and insightful comments. And so my next question is going to be rather general, but if you can just do your best to answer it. How did the Arabs manage to conquer Egypt, and why were they so successful?
That's a tough question.
Yeah.
There's a lot of factors.
Yes.
Lot of factors. One of the more important ones is just how fragmented the Byzantine response was. The Byzantines did not have a sufficient response for the Arabs. It's hard to be overly critical because, again, putting our minds or taking ourselves back to that time, right before the conquest, if you would ask your average Egyptian, Syrian, Greek, who is a threat to the Roman Empire, they will tell you it's the Persians.
Right.
You go to the Persians, who's the threat to the Sassanid Empire? They'll tell you it's the Romans. Mm-hmm. What about the Arabs? The response would be, what about them? Mm-hmm. It's like, they're merchants. We'll deal with them now and again. Mm-hmm. They're usually too busy fighting with each other over blood feuds and killing each other to bother anybody. What about the Arabs? Mm-hmm. We're not really expecting large unified Arab armies to come out of the peninsula and attack Egypt or Persia. That just simply wasn't even in their realm of possibilities or thinking. And how armies were organized at that time, how defenses were organized at that time, the fact that you had a major bout of the plague sweeping through 10 years earlier, and the numbers there as to the number of people killed is that fluctuates, but it was definitely a major wave, and that affects your preparedness for war. That affects your economy, because of farmers are dead. They're not sowing anything in the ground. They're not harvesting anything from the ground. So there's a cascading effect to all of this, and in many ways, the Arabs really struck at a very opportune moment, and they capitalized
I see.
on what they did. And in the Sasanian Empire, they had all of these challenges, but they also had a series of reforms. I don't want to belabor the point, but they had a series of reforms that go back at least a century prior to the Arab conquest. All of these fiscal and military reforms looked great on paper, and until you think, well, what if an army actually comes out of the peninsula, which is not in the realm of calculations, that would exploit a weakness in this whole fabulous defensive scheme that you have now, and is going to literally make your forces collapse on themselves. Mm-hmm. And that's basically what happens with the Persians. The Persians, on paper, the way they had reorganized their military and their fisc, as far as levying taxes, collecting taxes, so on and so forth, that looked great on the eve of the conquest. Mm-hmm. But it did not take into account armies coming out of the peninsula and attacking that western flank of their empire, and the rest is history.
Yes. And okay. And so before we draw this interview to a close, I'd just like to ask if ask you about any projects you might currently be working on.
Well, I mean, at the moment, I'm kind of somewhat between projects. I mean, the big one was the life of Bishoy.
Yeah.
That one, we weren't able to include the Arabic and Syriac lives in the book, the text in the book. We included the translations. So I'm hoping to have those out in something of the foreseeable future. And there's a couple of kind of other smaller projects and book reviews and what have you that I need to wrap up over the summer before I kind of start thinking about the next major project. There's a couple that are kind of floating around in my mind, but nothing definitive as of yet. The main thing is just getting the text for the life of Emir Bishoy out, which is a long life. It's a long text.
Okay, well, all right, Dr. Mikhail, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed this interview.
Thank you. My pleasure. My pleasure.